Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we'll explore a case that highlights the tragic reality of domestic violence and the courage it takes to break free from an abusive relationship. This is the story of Laura Sardinha, a young woman with dreams of helping others, whose life was cut short in September 2020. Laura Sardinha was 25 years old in the summer of 2020, living in Huntington Beach, California. She was pursuing a degree in psychology, driven by a deeply personal mission. Laura had experienced the devastating effects of domestic violence firsthand, and she channeled that pain into purpose. Her dream was to become a therapist who specialized in helping women escape abusive relationships. It was work that meant everything to her, because she understood the fear, the isolation, and the desperate need for someone who truly understood. Those who knew Laura described her as compassionate and determined. She had a warm smile that could light up a room, and an empathetic nature that drew people to her. Friends often sought her advice, knowing that Laura would listen without judgment and offer support when they needed it most. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who checked in during difficult times, who made others feel seen and valued. Laura lived in a modest apartment in Huntington Beach, a coastal city known for its beautiful beaches and laid-back atmosphere. She had worked hard to create a safe space for herself, decorating it with plants and photos of friends and family. It was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place where she could focus on her studies and build the future she envisioned. But sanctuary, as Laura would tragically learn, can be violated when the threat comes from someone who was once trusted, someone who knows exactly where to find you. In June 2020, Laura met Craig James Sharon. He was 37 years old, an Air Force veteran who initially seemed charming and attentive. The 12-year age difference didn't concern Laura at first. Craig appeared stable, mature, and interested in building something real with her. Like many abusive relationships, theirs began with what psychologists call the honeymoon phase, a period of intense affection and attention that can feel overwhelming in the best possible way. Craig was generous with compliments and gifts. He made Laura feel special, chosen. He wanted to spend all his time with her, which felt romantic rather than concerning in those early weeks. When he suggested they move in together after just a short time dating, Laura hesitated only briefly. The whirlwind romance felt exciting, and Craig's persistence seemed like evidence of his commitment. They found a place together, and for a few weeks, Laura felt hopeful about their future. Craig could be funny and charming when he wanted to be. He told stories about his time in the Air Force, and Laura admired his service to their country. He seemed to support her academic goals and her dream of becoming a therapist. But as anyone who has studied domestic violence knows, the honeymoon phase never lasts. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Craig began to change. Or perhaps more accurately, he began to reveal who he truly was beneath the charming facade. By August 2020, just 2 months after they had met, the relationship had begun to deteriorate rapidly. What Laura initially mistook for passionate intensity revealed itself to be something much darker: control, possessiveness, and a dangerous temper. Craig's behavior became increasingly erratic and demanding. He wanted to know where Laura was at all times, who she was talking to, what she was doing when they weren't together. He would go through her phone, checking her messages and social media activity. When Laura tried to maintain her friendships or focus on her schoolwork, Craig would become angry, accusing her of not caring about their relationship. The verbal abuse started gradually. Craig would criticize Laura's appearance, her intelligence, her dreams of becoming a therapist. He told her she was too sensitive, too emotional, that she wouldn't be able to handle helping other people when she couldn't even handle their relationship properly. These attacks on her character and aspirations were particularly cruel, as they targeted the very core of who Laura was and what she hoped to become. Then came the physical abuse. It started with grabbing her arm too tightly during arguments, squeezing until it left marks. Then pushing, shoving, and eventually more serious violence. Craig was significantly larger than Laura, and he used his size to intimidate and control her. When Laura would try to defend herself or fight back, Craig would claim she was the aggressor, that he was only defending himself. Laura began to document the abuse, recording conversations and taking photos of injuries. This was an incredibly brave decision that many domestic violence survivors struggle with. Part of her was already planning her escape, even as another part of her hoped that somehow, things would get better. What Laura didn't know at the time was that she wasn't Craig's first victim. During the subsequent investigation and trial, a disturbing pattern would emerge. 3 of Craig's ex-girlfriends would eventually come forward to testify about their own experiences with his violence. One woman described how Craig had choked her and hit her in the head with a wine bottle during an argument. The attack was so severe that she feared for her life. Another ex-girlfriend testified about how Craig had slapped her and poured vodka over her head in a humiliating display of dominance and control. All 3 women had taken out restraining orders against Craig, legal documents that painted a clear picture of a man who repeatedly used violence to control the women in his life. These stories would prove crucial during the trial, as they established a pattern of behavior that contradicted Craig's later claims of self-defense. They showed that Laura's experience wasn't an isolated incident or a relationship gone wrong, but rather part of a consistent pattern of domestic violence that Craig had inflicted on multiple partners over the years. The fact that these women found the courage to come forward and testify against Craig cannot be overstated. Domestic violence survivors often face significant barriers to speaking out, including fear of retaliation, shame, and concern that they won't be believed. Their willingness to share their stories helped ensure that Laura would receive justice. By late August 2020, Laura had reached her breaking point. The abuse was escalating, and she realized that staying in the relationship could cost her life. Making the decision to leave an abusive partner is one of the most dangerous times for domestic violence victims, and Laura seemed to understand this instinctively. She began planning her exit carefully. Laura confided in her mother and best friend about what was happening, building a support network that would prove crucial in the days to come. She researched resources for domestic violence survivors, perhaps drawing on her psychology studies to understand the dynamics of what she was experiencing. Laura also continued to document Craig's behavior, recording conversations and gathering evidence of his abuse. This took tremendous courage, as discovery of these recordings could have resulted in even more severe violence. But Laura understood that she might need proof of what was happening, either for legal proceedings or simply to remind herself that the abuse was real when Craig inevitably tried to minimize or deny it. On September 2, 2020, Laura took a decisive step toward reclaiming her life and safety. She had the locks changed on their apartment. This simple act represented so much more than just replacing door hardware. It was Laura drawing a clear boundary, declaring that she would no longer accept Craig's presence in her home or her life. She sent Craig a text message that day, making her position crystal clear. She was done with him, done with the relationship, done with the abuse. It was a message of finality that many domestic violence survivors dream of sending but often lack the courage or resources to follow through on. September 2, 2020, began with promise for Laura. Having changed the locks and officially ended the relationship, she felt a sense of freedom that she hadn't experienced in months. Friends and family would later describe her as seeming happy and free that day, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Around 1:15 in the afternoon, Laura was on a three-way phone call with her mother and her best friend. It was the kind of call that many young women have with the important people in their lives, catching up, sharing news, maybe planning future activities. Laura's voice was light and animated during the conversation. For the first time in months, she sounded like herself again. But Craig had not accepted Laura's decision to end the relationship. Despite the changed locks, despite the clear message that she wanted him out of her life, he had found a way into the apartment. Perhaps he still had a key that Laura didn't know about, or maybe he found another way to gain entry. The exact method doesn't matter as much as the terrifying reality that Laura's attempt to create safety had been breached. During the phone call with her mother and best friend, Laura's tone suddenly changed. The light, happy conversation was interrupted by a chilling realization that would change everything. "Oh my God, he's here," Laura said into the phone. Those 4 words contained a universe of fear. Laura's mother and best friend immediately understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't Craig stopping by to retrieve belongings or to have a calm conversation about the end of their relationship. This was a dangerous man who had violated Laura's boundaries and entered her home without permission, just hours after she had taken steps to keep him out. Laura's best friend, understanding the immediate danger, hung up the three-way call to dial 911. It was a quick-thinking decision that potentially could have saved Laura's life if help had arrived in time. Every second counted now, and emergency services needed to be alerted as quickly as possible. But Laura, perhaps feeling alone and terrified after her friend hung up, called her friend back. What happened next would become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the subsequent murder trial. The call went to voicemail, and Laura, not realizing this, continued to speak into the phone. For 37 seconds, the voicemail captured the sound of Laura being attacked. Prosecutors would later describe this recording as sounding like a woman narrating her own murder. The audio contained Laura's voice, growing increasingly distressed and desperate, as Craig carried out his violent assault. The content of that voicemail is too disturbing to describe in detail, but it provided investigators with crucial evidence about what happened in Laura's final moments. It captured not just the sounds of violence, but Laura's courage in trying to communicate what was happening, even as she was being attacked. This recording would become central to the prosecution's case, providing undeniable evidence that Craig had murdered Laura. It also served as a testament to Laura's strength. Even in her final moments, she was still fighting, still trying to get help, still refusing to give up. Police arrived at Laura's apartment at approximately 1:15 p.m., responding to the 911 call placed by her best friend. What they found inside was a scene of horrific violence that would stay with the responding officers for the rest of their careers. Laura Sardinha was found dead, having suffered multiple stab wounds. The attack had been brutal and personal. She had been stabbed twice in the chest with such force that the wounds were fatal. In addition to the chest wounds, Craig had nearly severed Laura's nose, an injury that spoke to the personal, rage-filled nature of the attack. The crime scene told a story of a struggle, of Laura fighting for her life against a man who was larger and stronger. It was clear that multiple knives had been used in the attack, suggesting that this wasn't a single moment of lost control, but a sustained and deliberate assault. Craig was found at the scene as well, suffering from wounds to his chest and neck. These injuries would become a point of contention during the trial. Craig would claim that Laura had attacked him with a knife and that he had acted in self-defense. However, investigators and prosecutors were skeptical of this account. The positioning of Craig's wounds, their severity and location, suggested to many that they were self-inflicted, a common tactic used by domestic violence perpetrators to support false claims of self-defense. The idea that Laura, a woman significantly smaller than Craig, had somehow managed to wound him before being overpowered and killed, struck investigators as highly unlikely given the evidence at the scene. In the days following Laura's murder, investigators began piecing together the full scope of what had happened. They had several crucial pieces of evidence: the 37-second voicemail recording, Laura's text messages to Craig ending the relationship, evidence that she had changed her locks that very day, and the documented history of Craig's abuse. Perhaps most damning was a recording that Laura had made the morning of her death. Craig had woken her up early, demanding oral sex in a way that was clearly aggressive and coercive. Laura had the presence of mind to record this interaction, and on the audio, she could be heard telling Craig to leave her alone and get away from her. This recording provided crucial context about Craig's state of mind and behavior on the day of the murder. The investigation also revealed the extent of Craig's history of domestic violence. Police spoke with his ex-girlfriends, learning about the pattern of abuse that had characterized his romantic relationships. They obtained copies of the restraining orders that had been filed against him, building a comprehensive picture of a man who repeatedly used violence to control women. Text messages between Craig and Laura provided additional evidence of his controlling and threatening behavior. Even after Laura had made it clear that the relationship was over, Craig had continued to call and text her, refusing to accept her decision. This digital trail supported the prosecution's theory that Craig had murdered Laura because she had dared to leave him. Craig James Sharon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Laura Sardinha. The case would take several years to come to trial, during which time Laura's family and friends lived with the pain of her loss while waiting for justice. The prosecution's case was built around several key elements: the voicemail recording, the evidence of Craig's history of domestic violence, the timing of the murder, occurring on the same day Laura changed her locks and officially ended the relationship, and the nature of Laura's injuries, which indicated a personal, rage-filled attack. Craig's defense team faced an uphill battle. The evidence against him was substantial and compelling. However, they chose to pursue a self-defense strategy, claiming that Laura had attacked Craig with a knife and that he had acted to protect himself. This strategy required them to essentially argue that Laura, a woman who weighed significantly less than Craig and had no history of violence, had somehow initiated a deadly confrontation. The self-defense claim was undermined by several factors: Craig's documented history of domestic violence against multiple partners, the fact that he had entered Laura's apartment without permission after she had changed the locks, and the nature of Laura's injuries, which were consistent with her being the victim of an attack rather than the aggressor. During the trial, which took place in Santa Ana, Orange County, the prosecution called several key witnesses who helped paint a complete picture of who Craig Sharon was and what Laura Sardinha had endured. The most powerful testimony came from Craig's 3 ex-girlfriends, who courageously took the stand to describe their own experiences with his violence. These women had nothing to gain by testifying; in fact, they faced potential harassment and retaliation for speaking out. But they understood that their voices could help ensure justice for Laura. The first woman described being choked by Craig and having a wine bottle smashed against her head. She testified about the terror she felt during the attack and the lasting impact it had on her life. The second woman told the court about being slapped and having vodka poured over her head, a humiliating assault that demonstrated Craig's need to dominate and degrade the women in his life. These testimonies were crucial because they established a clear pattern of behavior. They showed that what happened to Laura wasn't an isolated incident or a relationship that had simply gone wrong. Instead, it was part of a consistent pattern of a man who used violence to control women, especially when those women tried to assert their independence or leave the relationship. Laura's mother and best friend also testified, describing the happy, hopeful person Laura had been and the fear that had crept into her life as Craig's abuse escalated. They testified about the phone call on September 2nd, about Laura's voice when she realized Craig was in her apartment, and about the desperate attempts to get help to her as quickly as possible. Craig's defense attorneys found themselves in an almost impossible position. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his history of domestic violence made any claim of self-defense highly implausible. Nevertheless, they were bound by their ethical obligations to provide Craig with vigorous representation. During the trial, Craig took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that allowed prosecutors to cross-examine him directly. His testimony was inconsistent and unconvincing. He claimed that his memory of the confrontation with Laura was hazy, but maintained that she had come at him with a knife and that he had responded in self-defense. "I didn't quite comprehend what was happening in the moment," Craig testified. "It's taking me a second to understand I'm being cut up." This testimony rang hollow to many observers. If Craig was truly confused and acting in self-defense, how had he managed to inflict such severe and fatal wounds on Laura while sustaining only minor injuries himself? How had a woman significantly smaller than him managed to pose such a threat that deadly force was necessary? The prosecution was able to effectively cross-examine Craig, pointing out the inconsistencies in his story and highlighting the implausibility of his self-defense claim. They also emphasized that regardless of who had the knife first, Craig had no right to be in Laura's apartment in the first place, having entered without permission after she had changed the lock specifically to keep him out. Orange County Deputy District Attorney Janine Madera delivered a powerful closing argument that focused on the evidence and the larger issue of domestic violence. She reminded the jury that they had heard Laura's final moments captured on the voicemail recording, describing it as the sound of a woman narrating her own murder. Madera emphasized that this case was about more than just the events of September 2, 2020. It was about a pattern of abuse that had characterized Craig's relationships with women, a pattern that had escalated to murder when Laura dared to assert her independence and leave. The prosecutor also addressed Craig's self-defense claim directly, pointing out the implausibility of his story given the evidence. "It doesn't matter if he self-inflicted wounds or if she defended herself," Madera told the jury, emphasizing that Craig had no right to be in Laura's apartment and that his presence there was inherently threatening and illegal. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, walking the jury through each piece of evidence and showing how they all pointed to the same conclusion: Craig Sharon had murdered Laura Sardinha because she had tried to leave him, and he couldn't accept losing control over her. The jury began their deliberations on a Monday afternoon, and their task was not a difficult one. The evidence against Craig was overwhelming, and his defense's self-defense claim was unconvincing given the circumstances and his history of violence. In less than a full day of deliberations, the jury reached their verdict. On Tuesday, they found Craig James Sharon guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laura Sardinha. The conviction included a sentencing enhancement for the personal use of a knife, reflecting the particularly brutal nature of the crime. The speed of the verdict spoke to the strength of the prosecution's case and the clarity of the evidence. The jury had seen through Craig's attempts to portray himself as a victim and had recognized the truth: he was a domestic violence perpetrator who had murdered his ex-girlfriend because she had dared to leave him. For Laura's family and friends, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never truly heal the wound left by her loss. They had fought for years to see Craig held accountable for what he had done, and the jury's decision validated their belief that Laura deserved justice. In July 2025, Craig James Sharon appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. At 39 years old, he faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison for Laura's murder. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Laura's loved ones to speak about the impact of her loss. Family members and friends described the vibrant, caring woman that Laura had been and the bright future that had been stolen from her. They spoke about her dreams of becoming a therapist who helped other women escape abusive relationships, a dream that made her murder particularly tragic and senseless. Throughout the sentencing proceedings, Craig showed no remorse for his actions. This lack of accountability and empathy was noted by the court and by observers who had followed the case. Even when faced with the consequences of his violence, Craig seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge the harm he had caused. The judge sentenced Craig James Sharon to 26 years to life in prison. This sentence reflected both the severity of his crime and his history of domestic violence. Given his age, it's likely that Craig will spend the remainder of his life behind bars, unable to harm any other women. The sentence brought a sense of closure to Laura's loved ones, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. They had seen justice served, and they could take some comfort in knowing that Craig would never again be free to abuse another woman. Laura Sardinha's story is tragic, but it also serves an important purpose in raising awareness about domestic violence. Her case illustrates many of the key dynamics that characterize abusive relationships: the cycle of violence, the escalation that often occurs when victims try to leave, and the importance of having support systems in place. Laura did many things right in trying to escape her abusive relationship. She documented the abuse, confided in trusted friends and family members, and took concrete steps to protect herself by changing her locks and ending the relationship clearly. Unfortunately, these protective measures weren't enough to save her life, which highlights the particular danger that domestic violence victims face when they try to leave their abusers. Statistics show that the period when a victim is leaving or has just left an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time. Abusers may escalate their violence when they realize they're losing control, sometimes with fatal consequences. Laura's case is a heartbreaking example of this dynamic. Her story has been covered extensively in true crime media, not for sensational purposes, but because it illustrates important truths about domestic violence that society needs to understand. The voicemail recording, while deeply disturbing, provides undeniable evidence of what domestic violence can escalate to when left unchecked. Laura's case offers several important lessons for understanding and preventing domestic violence. First, it demonstrates the importance of recognizing patterns of abusive behavior. Craig's violence against multiple partners showed that his abuse of Laura wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of controlling and violent behavior. The case also highlights the courage required to leave an abusive relationship. Laura made the difficult decision to end her relationship with Craig despite his attempts to control and intimidate her. She took concrete steps to protect herself and reached out to her support network for help. These actions took tremendous bravery, especially given Craig's history of violence. Unfortunately, Laura's story also illustrates the limitations of individual protective measures when dealing with determined abusers. Changing locks, ending relationships clearly, and seeking support are all important steps, but they may not be sufficient to ensure safety when dealing with someone willing to commit extreme violence. The involvement of Craig's ex-girlfriends in the trial proceedings demonstrates the importance of survivors speaking out about their experiences. Their willingness to testify helped establish the pattern of behavior that was crucial to securing Craig's conviction. Their courage in coming forward honors Laura's memory and helps ensure that justice was served. Laura Sardinha's murder occurred during a time when domestic violence rates were rising across the United States. The COVID-19 pandemic had created conditions that made domestic violence more likely and more severe, as lockdowns and economic stress created additional pressures while limiting victims' access to support services and escape routes. Laura's case also highlights the particular vulnerability of young women who are pursuing education and careers that threaten their abuser's sense of control. Laura's studies in psychology and her dream of helping other domestic violence survivors may have particularly threatened Craig, who relied on control and intimidation to maintain his relationships. The fact that Craig was an Air Force veteran adds another layer to this case, as military service can sometimes provide abusers with additional skills, training, or social credibility that they can use to intimidate victims or avoid accountability. However, it's important to note that military service itself doesn't cause domestic violence. Many veterans never engage in abusive behavior, while many abusers have no military background. Laura's story is part of a larger epidemic of domestic violence that affects millions of people each year. Her case received significant media attention partly because of the dramatic evidence provided by the voicemail recording, but countless other victims suffer and die without such clear documentation of their abusers' crimes. If Laura's story resonates with you because you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline provides 24/7 support and can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. They offer confidential support, safety planning, and referrals to local resources. Many communities also have local domestic violence organizations that provide shelter, counseling, legal advocacy, and other services. These organizations understand the complex dynamics of abusive relationships and can help victims develop safety plans and access resources. It's important to remember that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for victims, which is why professional support and safety planning are so crucial. If you're concerned about someone you know who may be experiencing domestic violence, offer support without judgment and help them connect with professional resources. Laura's dream was to become a therapist who helped women escape abusive relationships. While her life was tragically cut short, her story continues to serve that mission by raising awareness about domestic violence and the importance of supporting survivors. Laura Sardinha was more than a victim of domestic violence. She was a daughter, a friend, a student with dreams and aspirations. She was someone who wanted to make the world better by helping other women escape the kind of situation that ultimately cost her own life. Those who knew Laura remember her warmth, her empathy, and her determination to help others. They remember her laugh, her kindness, and her unwavering belief that people could overcome difficult circumstances with the right support and resources. Laura's story ends in tragedy, but her legacy continues through the awareness her case has raised about domestic violence. Every person who learns about the warning signs of abuse, every survivor who finds the courage to seek help, every community that strengthens its support services for domestic violence victims, all of these represent ways that Laura's memory continues to make a difference. The courtroom where Craig Sharon was convicted has seen many cases, but Laura's case stands out for the powerful evidence it provided about the reality of domestic violence. The voicemail recording that captured her final moments serves as undeniable proof of the violence that too many women face behind closed doors. As we conclude this story, we remember Laura Sardinha not just as a victim, but as a young woman who faced incredible adversity with courage and who continues to inspire others through her story. Her life mattered, her dreams mattered, and her memory deserves to be honored by our continued efforts to prevent domestic violence and support survivors. If you or someone you know needs help, please don't hesitate to reach out. Laura's story reminds us that domestic violence can affect anyone, but it also reminds us that there are people and organizations ready to help those who need it most. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to the sun-soaked shores of Florida's Panhandle, where military families often find themselves stationed amid the pristine beaches and coastal communities. But beneath the veneer of this peaceful military town, a story of devastating betrayal would unfold that would shock investigators, captivate the nation through television crime shows, and ultimately end 3 decades later in one of Florida's most controversial executions. This is the story of the Zakrzewski family murders, a case that began with what seemed like a missing persons report and evolved into one of the most chilling family annihilation cases in Florida's criminal history. In the early 1980s, the world seemed full of possibility for a young airman named Edward John Zakrzewski II. Born on January 31, 1965, Edward, who preferred to go by Zach among his friends, embodied the disciplined, goal-oriented mindset that the United States Air Force sought in its recruits. Standing at average height with brown hair and an earnest demeanor, Zach appeared to be every inch the reliable serviceman. The Air Force had taken him far from his hometown, stationing him in South Korea in 1982, where the sounds of a foreign language mixed with the familiar cadence of military life. It was there, among the bustling markets and ancient temples of Seoul, that Zach's life would take a pivotal turn. He met Sylvia, a woman 5 years his senior, whose warm smile and intelligent conversation drew him in immediately. Sylvia was 34 when they first encountered each other, a woman who had seen enough of the world to appreciate stability when she found it. In Zach, she saw a man with ambition, someone climbing the ranks of the military with steady determination. Their courtship bloomed against the backdrop of international service, creating a bond that seemed unshakable as they navigated the unique challenges of military life overseas. Their love story culminated in marriage, and soon their small family began to grow. First came Edward Jr., whom they affectionately called Kim, a bright-eyed boy who would grow to be 7 years old by the time our story reaches its tragic climax. 2 years later, their family expanded again with the arrival of Anna, a precocious little girl with her mother's intelligent eyes and her father's determined spirit. By 1992, Technical Sergeant Edward Zakshevsky II had built what appeared to be an enviable life. The Air Force had recognized his capabilities and transferred him to Eglin Air Force Base in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. This wasn't just any assignment. Eglin was one of the most prestigious Air Force installations in the country, sprawling across the Florida Panhandle with its cutting-edge research facilities and prime location near the Gulf of Mexico. The family settled in Mary Esther, a small community that served as a bedroom town for military families stationed at Eglin. Here, Spanish moss draped ancient oak trees, and the salt air carried the promise of weekend beach trips and barbecues in suburban backyards. It was the kind of place where children rode their bicycles freely through quiet neighborhoods while parents waved to each other from their driveways. Zach seemed to be living the perfect military family life. By day, he fulfilled his duties as a technical sergeant, a rank that commanded respect and came with significant responsibilities. His colleagues knew him as dependable, someone who could be counted on to complete his assignments with precision and thoroughness. But Zach harbored larger ambitions. He had enrolled as a part-time college student, working toward a degree that would open even more doors in his military career. The Zakshevsky family appeared, from the outside, to be thriving. They had a comfortable home in a safe neighborhood, 2 healthy children who were excelling in school, and a father whose military career seemed destined for continued advancement. Neighbors would later describe them as quiet, polite, and unremarkable in the way that suggests contentment rather than drama. But appearances, as we so often discover in these stories, can be devastatingly deceiving. The year 1994 began like any other for the Zakshevsky family, but beneath the surface of their seemingly stable life, tensions had begun to simmer. Those who knew the family well would later recall subtle signs that all was not well in the household on their quiet Mary Esther Street. Marriage, even in the best of circumstances, requires constant nurturing and communication. Add to this the unique pressures of military life, the rigid schedules, the hierarchy that follows service members home, the constant possibility of reassignment, and even the strongest relationships can begin to show strain. For Sylvia and Edward, the pressures were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Sylvia had begun to express concerns about their relationship that went beyond the typical marital disagreements about finances or child-rearing responsibilities. Friends and family members would later recall conversations where she seemed increasingly unhappy, mentioning that she felt isolated and that communication with her husband had become strained and difficult. The breaking point came in the spring of 1994, when Sylvia made a decision that would ultimately seal the fate of her entire family. She approached Edward with a request that must have felt like an earthquake in his carefully ordered world. She wanted a divorce. For a man who had built his identity around control, precision, and the maintenance of proper appearances, this request represented more than just the end of a marriage. In Edward's mind, it threatened to unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. His reputation in the military community, his image as a stable family man, his plans for the future, all of it seemed to hang in the balance of this unwanted conversation. The weeks that followed Sylvia's request were marked by an atmosphere of increasing tension in the Zakshevsky household. Edward, who had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems through methodical planning and decisive action, found himself facing a situation that couldn't be resolved through military discipline or academic study. Neighbors later reported that the family seemed more withdrawn than usual during this period. The children, 7-year-old Kim and 5-year-old Anna, continued their routines of school and play, seemingly unaware that their parents' marriage was disintegrating around them. But for any observant adult, the signs of trouble were beginning to show. Edward's behavior at work began to reflect the stress he was experiencing at home. Though he maintained his professional facade, colleagues noticed that he seemed more distracted, less engaged in the casual conversations that typically marked military life. The man who had once been known for his reliability and attention to detail was struggling to maintain his usual standards. At home, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Sylvia, having made the difficult decision to end her marriage, began making practical plans for her future as a single mother. This meant researching apartments, considering childcare arrangements, and preparing for the complex logistics of a military divorce. Each step she took toward independence must have felt like a betrayal to Edward, whose worldview couldn't accommodate the idea that his carefully constructed life could simply come apart. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on those who knew the family well. Here was a man trained in the military arts, someone who understood strategy and tactics, someone who had been taught to assess threats and respond with appropriate force. But the threat he perceived wasn't an enemy soldier or a foreign adversary, it was his own wife's desire for freedom and happiness. As spring turned toward summer in 1994, the Zakrzewski family was living under the same roof but inhabiting completely different emotional worlds. Sylvia was planning for a future that didn't include her husband. Edward was desperately trying to find a way to prevent that future from coming to pass. And two innocent children were simply trying to navigate their daily lives, unaware that their father was beginning to formulate a plan that would ensure the family stayed together forever, in the most horrific way imaginable. June 9, 1994, dawned like any other summer day in the Florida Panhandle. The humid air carried the scent of blooming magnolias and the distant salt tang of the Gulf of Mexico. For most residents of Mary Esther, it was simply another Thursday, a day for work, for school, for the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. Edward Zakrzewski left for Eglin Air Force Base that morning, maintaining the routine that had structured his days for the past 2 years. To his colleagues, he appeared normal, perhaps slightly more subdued than usual, but nothing that would raise alarm bells in a military environment where stoicism was valued above emotional expression. But Edward's mind was not on his duties that day. Instead, he was consumed with thoughts of the conversation he had been having with himself for weeks, an internal dialogue that had grown progressively darker as he contemplated the dissolution of his marriage and the impact it would have on what he perceived as his carefully crafted life. In Edward's distorted thinking, Sylvia's request for a divorce wasn't just a personal rejection, it was a threat to everything he valued about himself. His identity as a family man, his standing in the military community, his vision of his children's future, all of it seemed to hang in the balance. And Edward, trained to neutralize threats, had begun to see his family not as people he loved, but as problems that needed to be solved. The morning hours at Eglin passed slowly for Edward. He went through the motions of his responsibilities, but his thoughts kept returning to the house in Mary Esther, to the wife who wanted to leave him, to the children who would be taken away from him in a custody arrangement. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that there was only one way to keep his family together. Sometime during the early afternoon, Edward made his decision. He would later claim that his actions were motivated by love, by a desire to spare his family the pain of divorce proceedings and the uncertainty of separation. But investigators would recognize his reasoning for what it truly was, the self-serving rationalization of a man who had decided that if he couldn't have his family on his terms, then no one could have them at all. Edward left his post at Eglin Air Force Base earlier than usual that day, telling his colleagues that he wasn't feeling well. It was a lie, but perhaps not entirely. The weight of his intentions must have created a kind of sickness in his soul that manifested as physical discomfort. He drove home through the familiar streets of Mary Esther, past the neat suburban houses where his neighbors were going about their ordinary lives, oblivious to the tragedy that was about to unfold in their quiet community. As he pulled into his driveway, Edward knew that this would be the last normal moment his family would ever experience. The house was empty when he arrived, Sylvia was still at work, and the children were at school. This gave Edward time to prepare for what he had convinced himself was necessary. He went to his tool shed and retrieved a machete and a crowbar, tools that in any other context would have been used for yard work and home maintenance. But Edward had repurposed them for something far more sinister. He carefully positioned the machete in the bathroom, hiding it where it would be easily accessible but not immediately visible to his unsuspecting family members. The crowbar he kept with him, holding it like a talisman of his resolve. As the afternoon wore on, Edward waited. He later described this period as one of calm determination, but it's impossible to imagine the true psychological state of a man preparing to murder his own family. Whatever thoughts went through his mind during those hours of waiting, they had moved far beyond the realm of rational human emotion and into the territory of something much darker and more disturbing. The sound of Sylvia's car in the driveway must have sent a jolt of adrenaline through Edward's system. She was home from work, probably tired from her day, perhaps thinking about dinner preparations or helping the children with homework. She had no way of knowing that her husband was waiting for her with murder in his heart. When Sylvia walked through the front door of her home that evening, she was entering what would become one of the most horrific crime scenes in Florida's criminal history. And Edward, the man she had once loved enough to marry, the father of her children, was about to transform from a husband into a killer. What happened next in the Zakshevsky home defies comprehension and challenges our understanding of human nature. The details of that evening are both crucial to understanding the full scope of this tragedy and difficult to recount without feeling the full weight of their horror. Sylvia entered her home expecting the familiar routines of family life. Perhaps she was thinking about what to prepare for dinner, or wondering how the children's day at school had gone. Instead, she encountered her husband in a state that she had never seen before. Edward, the man she had once trusted enough to build a life with, was holding a crowbar and looking at her with eyes that no longer held any trace of love or recognition. The attack on Sylvia was vicious and prolonged. Edward struck her repeatedly with the crowbar, the metal weapon causing devastating injuries to her head and body. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy whatever rage or desperation had consumed him. When she fell to the floor, gravely wounded but possibly still clinging to life, Edward wrapped his hands around her throat and strangled her until her struggles ceased forever. The scene that investigators would later discover suggested that Sylvia had fought for her life, desperately trying to defend herself against the man who had sworn to protect her. But she was no match for Edward's size, strength, and the weapons he had prepared for this moment. With his wife's body lying still on the floor, Edward might have paused to consider the magnitude of what he had just done. A rational person might have called for help, might have been overwhelmed by horror at their actions, might have sought to minimize the damage they had caused. But Edward's thinking had moved far beyond rational thought. In his mind, he had only completed the first part of his plan. The children would be home from school soon. 7-year-old Kim and 5-year-old Anna had no way of knowing that their world had just been shattered forever. They walked home from school with the ordinary concerns of children their age, perhaps excited about a playground game they had played, or worried about a test they would take the next day. They had no reason to expect anything other than the familiar comfort of their home and family. When the children entered the house, they encountered a scene that no child should ever witness. Their mother lay dead, and their father, the man who had taught them to ride bicycles and helped them with homework, was waiting for them with the machete he had hidden in the bathroom. The details of what Edward did to his children are almost too horrible to recount, but they are part of the historical record of this case and crucial to understanding the full scope of his crimes. He attacked both children with the machete, inflicting wounds that would quickly prove fatal. Kim, at 7 years old, and Anna, at just 5, had no chance to defend themselves against their father's assault. Investigators who later processed the crime scene would describe it as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. The violence that Edward had inflicted on his family was extreme even by the standards of domestic homicide cases. The weapons he had chosen, the crowbar and machete, had caused injuries that spoke to a level of rage and brutality that defied explanation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Edward's crimes wasn't their violence, but their premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of temporary insanity brought on by overwhelming emotion. Edward had planned these murders, had prepared his weapons in advance, had waited calmly for his family to come home so that he could kill them. The level of calculated malice required for such actions reveals a depth of selfishness and cruelty that challenges our basic assumptions about human nature. When the violence finally ended, 3 innocent people lay dead in the Mary Esther home that had once been filled with the laughter of children and the ordinary joys of family life. Sylvia, who had simply wanted the freedom to rebuild her life in a way that would make her happy, had been silenced forever. Kim and Anna, who had done nothing more than be born to the wrong father, had been robbed of the decades of life that stretched ahead of them. And Edward, the man who had claimed to love his family so much that he couldn't bear to lose them, had ensured that he would never see them again, except in the nightmares that would presumably haunt whatever remained of his conscience. But his plan wasn't finished yet. Having eliminated what he saw as the problem of his dissolving family, Edward now had to address the problem of facing the consequences of his actions. And for that, he had prepared an escape route that would turn this domestic tragedy into a nationwide manhunt. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Edward Zakrzewski transformed from a family man into a fugitive. The methodical planning that had characterized his approach to the killings extended to his escape, suggesting that even as he was ending the lives of his wife and children, he was already thinking about how to avoid paying the price for his crimes. Edward had prepared for this moment. He had withdrawn money from family accounts, gathered important documents, and made arrangements that would allow him to disappear quickly and completely. While his family's blood was still fresh on his hands, he was already executing the next phase of his plan. He cleaned himself up, changed his clothes, and gathered the supplies he would need for an extended period on the run. Then, sometime in the early evening hours of June 9, Edward Zakrzewski walked out of the house where he had just committed 3 brutal murders and drove away into the gathering darkness. For the next 4 days, no one knew that anything was wrong. Edward had chosen his timing carefully. By killing his family on a Thursday evening, he had bought himself a long weekend before anyone would notice their absence. The children wouldn't be missed at school until Monday, and Sylvia's workplace wouldn't expect her back until after the weekend. On Monday, June 13, 1994, reality began to intrude on Edward's carefully planned escape. When he failed to report for duty at Eglin Air Force Base, his superiors initially assumed he was ill or dealing with a family emergency. But when repeated attempts to contact him at home went unanswered, concern began to grow. Military personnel are held to strict standards of accountability, and unexplained absences are taken seriously. When Edward's commanding officers couldn't reach him by phone, they decided to send someone to check on the family's welfare. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The discovery of the crime scene sent shockwaves through the military community at Eglin Air Force Base and the surrounding civilian neighborhoods. This wasn't a case of burglary gone wrong or random violence, it was the calculated destruction of an entire family by someone they had trusted and respected. The initial investigation moved quickly, with local law enforcement working alongside military police to process the scene and begin tracking Edward's movements. The evidence they found painted a clear picture of premeditated murder, but it also revealed the careful planning that Edward had put into his escape. By the time investigators realized that Edward was their primary suspect, he had already had a 4-day head start. In 1994, before cell phones and digital tracking made it easier to monitor people's movements, a 4-day head start was an enormous advantage for someone trying to disappear. Edward had driven to the airport and boarded a flight to Hawaii, choosing a destination that was both geographically isolated and popular enough with tourists that he might be able to blend in with the crowds. Hawaii represented the perfect hideout, thousands of miles from the crime scene, surrounded by ocean, and filled with people from all over the world who wouldn't know or recognize a fugitive from Florida. The manhunt for Edward Zakrzewski became a multi-agency effort involving local police, military investigators, the FBI, and eventually the U.S. Marshals Service. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and investigators began the painstaking process of tracking his movements and identifying potential hiding spots. Meanwhile, Edward was attempting to build a new life for himself in Hawaii. He had brought enough money to sustain himself for an extended period, and he began the process of trying to establish a new identity. But living as a fugitive, even in paradise, comes with its own set of challenges and stresses. Every knock on the door could be law enforcement. Every interaction with strangers carried the risk of recognition. Every news broadcast might contain updates about the investigation into his crimes. The psychological pressure of living with such constant anxiety, combined with the weight of what he had done, must have been enormous. The investigation back in Florida continued to gather momentum. Detectives interviewed friends, family members, and colleagues, building a comprehensive picture of the Zakrzewski family's final months and the circumstances that had led to the tragedy. The evidence of Edward's guilt was overwhelming, not just the physical evidence from the crime scene, but also the testimony of people who had witnessed the deterioration of his marriage and his increasingly erratic behavior. As summer turned to fall in 1994, Edward remained a free man, but the net was slowly closing around him. Law enforcement agencies had identified Hawaii as his likely destination, and investigators were working with local authorities to track down leads and potential sightings. The case also gained national attention when it was featured on the television show, Unsolved Mysteries, which broadcast Edward's photograph and details of his crimes to millions of viewers across the country. The show's format was perfect for a case like this, a dangerous fugitive who could be hiding anywhere, potentially putting other innocent people at risk. For Edward, watching his case featured on national television must have been a sobering reminder that he could never truly escape the consequences of his actions. No matter how far he ran or how well he hid, the murders of Sylvia, Kim, and Anna would always be waiting for him. The walls were closing in, and after 4 months of freedom, Edward Zakrzewski's time as a fugitive was about to come to an end. October 1994 found Edward Zakrzewski still hiding in Hawaii, but the Paradise Islands that had once seemed like the perfect refuge were beginning to feel more like a prison. The constant stress of living under a false identity, combined with the psychological weight of his crimes, was taking its toll on the fugitive killer. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, the power of television and the vigilance of ordinary citizens. When Unsolved Mysteries aired Edward's case to a national audience, it generated numerous tips from viewers who thought they had seen the fugitive. Most of these leads turned out to be false alarms, but one would prove to be exactly what investigators needed. A viewer in Hawaii recognized Edward from the television broadcast and contacted local authorities. The tip was credible enough to warrant immediate action, and Hawaiian law enforcement agencies began surveilling the area where Edward was believed to be hiding. On October 13, 1994, exactly 4 months after the murders, Edward Zakrzewski's life as a fugitive came to an end. Law enforcement officers, acting on the tip from the television viewer, located and arrested him without incident. The man who had brutally murdered his wife and children offered no resistance when confronted by the consequences of his actions. Edward's arrest made headlines across the country, both because of the horrific nature of his crimes and because it represented a successful example of how television crime shows could help solve real cases. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly to track him down, it was a moment of satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that nothing could bring back the 3 innocent lives that had been lost. The extradition process began immediately, with Edward being transported from Hawaii back to Florida to face charges for the murders of his family. During the long flight back to the mainland, he had hours to contemplate the path that had led him from respected military serviceman to captured killer. When Edward arrived in Florida, he was met by a media circus and a community still reeling from the shock of his crimes. The quiet suburb of Mary Esther had been forever changed by the violence that had occurred in one of its homes, and residents struggled to understand how someone they had known and trusted could have committed such unspeakable acts. The legal proceedings began with Edward's arraignment on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming: physical evidence from the crime scene, witness testimony about his deteriorating mental state before the murders, and his own flight from justice that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Edward's defense team faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend a man who had clearly and deliberately murdered his own wife and children? The only possible strategy was to try to mitigate the punishment by arguing for mental illness or extreme emotional disturbance, but even these arguments seemed inadequate in the face of the premeditated brutality of his crimes. As 1994 turned into 1995, Edward sat in a Florida jail cell, awaiting trial and contemplating a future that seemed certain to end in either life imprisonment or death. The man who had once worn the uniform of his country with pride was now dressed in the orange jumpsuit of an accused killer, his military career and family life nothing more than memories of a different person he used to be. The community of Mary Esther began the long process of healing from the trauma that Edward had inflicted. Memorial services were held for Sylvia, Kim, and Anna, attended by friends, neighbors, and fellow military families who struggled to make sense of the senseless violence that had torn apart a family they had known and liked. For those who had worked with Edward at Eglin Air Force Base, the revelation of his crimes forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people around us. How had someone capable of such violence managed to hide his true nature for so long? What signs had they missed? What could they have done differently? These questions would never have satisfactory answers, but they reflected the broader impact of Edward's crimes on everyone who had known the Zakrzewski family. The ripples of violence spread far beyond the immediate victims, affecting an entire community and leaving scars that would take years to heal. But for Edward, sitting in his jail cell and facing the prospect of trial, the time for reflection and regret had passed. The wheels of justice were now in motion, and he would soon have to face the full consequences of the choice he had made on that terrible June evening in 1994. The legal proceedings against Edward Zakrzewski moved through the Florida court system with the deliberate pace that characterizes capital murder cases. These are not matters to be rushed. When the state seeks to take a person's life as punishment for their crimes, every legal safeguard must be observed, every procedural requirement must be met with meticulous care. For more than a year, Edward's case wound its way through pre-trial hearings, motions, and negotiations. His defense attorneys explored every possible avenue for avoiding the death penalty, while prosecutors prepared to present a case that would demonstrate not only Edward's guilt, but also the aggravating factors that would justify the ultimate punishment under Florida law. The weight of the evidence against Edward was crushing. The physical evidence from the crime scene clearly established his guilt, while witness testimony painted a picture of a man who had planned and executed the murders with chilling deliberation. His flight to Hawaii after the killings only served to reinforce the prosecution's argument that he had acted with full knowledge of the criminality of his actions. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against Edward came from his own mouth. During the investigation and in conversations with law enforcement, he had made statements that revealed the cold calculation behind his crimes. He hadn't killed his family in a moment of passion or temporary insanity, he had murdered them because he believed it was preferable to allowing them to live lives that didn't include him. As the case moved toward trial, Edward and his legal team faced a crucial decision. They could proceed to trial and hope for a miracle, perhaps a sympathetic jury that would reject the death penalty in favor of life imprisonment. Or they could attempt to negotiate a plea agreement that would spare Edward from execution while ensuring that he would never be free again. The decision came in March 1996, nearly 2 years after the murders. Rather than face a jury trial where the death penalty seemed inevitable, Edward chose to plead guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. It was an acknowledgement of guilt that came far too late to save his family, but it did spare the community the trauma of a prolonged trial that would have rehashed every horrific detail of the crimes. Edward's guilty plea moved the case directly to the penalty phase, where a jury would decide whether he should be sentenced to death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. This phase of the proceedings was in many ways more crucial than a traditional trial. While Edward's guilt was no longer in question, his life still hung in the balance. During the penalty phase hearing, Edward himself took the stand to testify about the events of June 9, 1994. His testimony provided chilling insights into the mind of a family killer. He described how he had hidden the machete in the bathroom earlier that day, how he had waited for his family to come home, and how he had systematically murdered each of them. Perhaps most disturbing was Edward's claim that his actions had been motivated by love, that he had killed his wife and children to spare them the pain of divorce and the disruption it would bring to their lives. This twisted logic revealed the depth of his narcissism and his inability to understand that his family members were individuals with their own right to life and happiness, not possessions to be disposed of at his whim. The jury that heard Edward's penalty phase testimony was faced with an agonizing decision. On one hand, he had committed crimes of almost unimaginable brutality against the most vulnerable victims possible, his own wife and children. On the other hand, he had no prior criminal history and had served his country honorably in the military before his descent into violence. The deliberations were lengthy and difficult. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, they recommended death sentences for the murders of Sylvia and Kim, but life imprisonment without parole for the murder of 5-year-old Anna. The split verdict reflected the jury's struggle with the ultimate penalty, even in a case as clear-cut as this one appeared to be. However, under Florida law, the jury's recommendation was not binding on the judge. The final sentencing decision rested with the court, which had the authority to override the jury's recommendation in either direction. After reviewing all the evidence and considering the aggravating and mitigating factors in the case, the judge imposed 3 death sentences, one for each of Edward's victims. The sentence meant that Edward would join the hundreds of inmates on Florida's death row, beginning what would inevitably be a decades-long process of appeals and legal challenges. In capital cases, the appeals process is designed to ensure that no innocent person is executed and that proper legal procedures have been followed at every step. Even in cases where guilt is clear, these appeals can take many years to exhaust. For Edward, the death sentences represented the formal conclusion of his transformation from military serviceman to condemned killer. He would spend the rest of his life in a small cell, contemplating the choices that had led him to this point and waiting for the day when the state of Florida would carry out the punishment he had received. But the story of the Zakrzewski family murders was far from over. The appeals process would consume decades, during which Edward would file motion after motion challenging various aspects of his case. Meanwhile, the community of Mary Esther would continue to struggle with the legacy of his crimes, and the criminal justice system would grapple with questions about how to handle cases like this one. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn. And eventually, they would come full circle for Edward Zakrzewski. Life on Florida's death row is a peculiar form of existence, a prolonged limbo where condemned inmates wait for years or decades while their cases wind through the appeals process. For Edward Zakrzewski, the death sentences imposed in 1996 marked not the end of his legal journey, but the beginning of a marathon of motions, hearings, and court proceedings that would stretch across 3 decades. The appeals process in capital cases is designed to be exhaustive and thorough. Every aspect of the original trial is scrutinized, every legal precedent is examined, every possible error or oversight is investigated. This process, while time-consuming and expensive, serves a crucial purpose, ensuring that the ultimate penalty is only imposed when the legal system has done everything possible to guarantee fairness and accuracy. Edward's legal team filed the predictable series of appeals that characterize death penalty cases. They challenged the sufficiency of the evidence, argued that the death sentences were disproportionate to the crimes, and claimed that various errors had occurred during the legal proceedings. Each of these appeals required detailed legal briefs, court hearings, and careful consideration by appellate judges. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed Edward's case multiple times over the years, consistently upholding both his convictions and his death sentences. The court found that the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and that the aggravating factors in the case, including the especially heinous and cruel nature of the crimes and the fact that they involved multiple victims, clearly supported the death penalty. But the appeals process extends beyond state courts. Edward's attorneys also filed federal habeas corpus petitions, claiming that his constitutional rights had been violated in various ways. These federal appeals added additional years to the process, as federal judges carefully reviewed the state court proceedings to ensure that proper legal standards had been met. Throughout this lengthy appeals process, Edward remained housed in the stark confines of Florida State Prison in Stark, a facility that has served as the state's primary death row location for decades. His days were structured around the rigid routine of maximum security confinement, limited recreation time, restricted visitation, and the constant awareness that his life could end at any moment if his appeals were exhausted. The death row community is a strange microcosm of society, populated by individuals who have committed the most serious crimes imaginable yet who maintain their humanity even in the face of their impending executions. Some inmates use their time to pursue education, others to create art or write memoirs. Some find religion, while others retreat into themselves and await their fate with stoic resignation. For Edward, the decades on death row provided ample time for reflection on the choices that had brought him to this point. Whether he experienced genuine remorse for his crimes or continued to justify his actions as somehow necessary or understandable is known only to him and perhaps to any spiritual advisors he may have consulted over the years. The legal landscape around capital punishment continued to evolve during Edward's time on death row. New Supreme Court decisions refined the standards for imposing death sentences, while advances in forensic science occasionally led to the exoneration of wrongly convicted inmates. But none of these developments affected Edward's case. His guilt had never been in question, and the legal procedures in his case had been conducted properly. As the years turned into decades, Edward became one of the longest-serving inmates on Florida's death row. New arrivals came and went, some through successful appeals that resulted in life sentences, others through the execution chamber. But Edward remained, his appeals gradually being exhausted as courts at every level affirmed his convictions and death sentences. The passage of time brought changes to the world outside the prison walls that Edward would never experience. Technology advanced at a breathtaking pace, transforming how people communicated, worked, and lived their daily lives. The children who had been his son and daughter's age when he committed his crimes grew up, graduated from college, got married, and had children of their own. The world moved on, but Edward remained frozen in time, trapped by the consequences of a single horrific evening in 1994. By 2020, Edward had spent more than 2 decades on death row, becoming something of an institution within the prison system. Guards who had been young men when he first arrived were now approaching retirement. The legal system had processed hundreds of other capital cases while his appeals continued their glacial progress through the courts. The lengthy appeals process, while designed to protect the rights of the accused, had become a source of frustration for those who believed in swift justice. Critics argued that allowing death row inmates to file appeal after appeal indefinitely made a mockery of the criminal justice system and denied closure to victims' families and communities. Supporters of the current system countered that the complexity of capital cases and the irreversible nature of execution demanded exhaustive review. For Edward, each successful appeal meant more years of life, even if that life was confined to a small cell and governed by the rigid routine of maximum security. Each failed appeal brought him one step closer to the execution chamber. It was a psychological torture that was perhaps fitting for someone who had inflicted such profound suffering on others. As the 2020s began, Edward's legal options were finally beginning to run out. The appeals that had sustained him for decades were being systematically rejected by courts that had grown weary of reviewing the same arguments repeatedly. The evidence of his guilt remained as compelling as it had been in 1996, and no new legal developments had emerged that might spare his life. The COVID-19 pandemic temporarily slowed the execution process in Florida, as it did in many states, but it provided only a brief reprieve. As the world began to emerge from the pandemic's shadow, the machinery of capital punishment resumed its inexorable operation. In 2023, nearly 3 decades after the murders, Edward received the news that his appeals had been exhausted and that the state of Florida would soon set an execution date. The wheels of justice that had turned so slowly for so long were finally approaching their destination. The notification that his appeals had been exhausted arrived in Edward's cell like a death knell, which in many ways it was. After nearly 30 years of legal maneuvering, court filings, and desperate attempts to find some procedural error or constitutional violation that might spare his life, the legal system had spoken with finality. Edward John Zakrzewski too would die for the murders of his wife and children. The news reverberated through the death row community at Florida State Prison. Inmates who had known Edward for decades understood that his case had always been particularly strong for the prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes were especially heinous, and there were no significant legal issues that might provide grounds for reversal. But the finality of exhausted appeals still sent a chill through the population of condemned men who understood that each execution brought them closer to their own potential fate. Edward's legal team made one final attempt to save his life by filing a petition for clemency with the governor of Florida. Clemency represents the last hope for death row inmates whose appeals have been exhausted, a request for mercy from the chief executive of the state based on factors that might not have been fully considered by the courts. The clemency petition for Edward faced enormous obstacles. Unlike cases where new evidence of innocence had emerged or where questions about mental competency had been raised, Edward's petition had to rely on more subtle arguments about proportionality and mercy. His attorneys argued that the 3 decades he had already spent on death row constituted sufficient punishment for his crimes, and that executing him at this point would serve no meaningful purpose. The petition also highlighted Edward's behavior during his time in prison, noting that he had been a model inmate with no significant disciplinary issues. His attorneys argued that this demonstrated his capacity for rehabilitation and suggested that he no longer posed a threat to society. They pointed to his age, he was now in his late 50s, and argued that an elderly man who had spent most of his adult life in prison was not the same person who had committed the murders in 1994. But the clemency petition could not escape the fundamental reality of Edward's crimes. He had murdered his own wife and children in a calculated act of violence that had shocked even experienced investigators. The brutality of the murders, combined with the premeditated nature of the crimes and his flight from justice, created an almost insurmountable barrier to any argument for mercy. The families of Edward's victims, including Sylvia's relatives and friends who had maintained their desire for justice throughout the long appeals process, submitted their own statements to the Clemency Board. They described the ongoing pain and trauma that Edward's crimes had caused, not just in the immediate aftermath of the murders but continuing through the decades that followed. These family members spoke of birthdays and holidays that would forever be marked by absence, of grandchildren who would never know their grandmother and cousins, of a family tree that had been brutally severed by one man's selfish and violent choices. They argued that Edward had forfeited any claim to mercy when he decided to take the lives of 3 innocent people, including 2 young children who had loved and trusted him. The clemency hearing, when it finally took place, was a somber affair that brought together all the key players in a case that had stretched across 3 decades. Edward himself was given the opportunity to address the Clemency Board, to make one final plea for his life before the people who would recommend whether the governor should spare him from execution. In his statement to the Clemency Board, Edward attempted to express remorse for his crimes while also trying to explain the psychological state that had led him to commit them. He spoke of the pressure he had felt when his marriage began to collapse, of his fear of losing his children, and of his distorted belief that death was preferable to the pain of separation. But Edward's words rang hollow to many who heard them. His expression of remorse seemed calculated and self-serving, coming only after decades of appeals had failed and his execution date was approaching. If he truly felt remorse for his crimes, critics argued, why had it taken him 30 years to express it convincingly? The Clemency Board deliberated for several hours before reaching their decision. In the end, they voted unanimously to recommend that the governor deny clemency and allow the execution to proceed as scheduled. The board found that the aggravating factors in Edward's case, the premeditated murder of multiple victims, including young children, far outweighed any mitigating factors that might argue for mercy. Governor Ron DeSantis, following the Clemency Board's recommendation, denied Edward's petition for clemency. In a brief statement, the governor noted that the crimes were among the most heinous in Florida's history and that justice demanded that the death sentences be carried out. With the clemency petition denied, Edward faced the reality that his execution was now inevitable. The state of Florida announced that he would be executed by lethal injection on a date in late 2023, bringing to an end one of the longest-running death penalty cases in the state's history. For the community of Mary Esther, the announcement of Edward's execution date brought a complex mix of emotions. Some residents felt that justice was finally being served after decades of delay. Others questioned whether executing a man in his late 50s for crimes committed 30 years earlier served any meaningful purpose. All grappled with the knowledge that their quiet community would forever be associated with one of Florida's most notorious family murders. As Edward's execution date approached, the media attention that had first focused on the case in 1994 returned with renewed intensity. News outlets prepared retrospective pieces about the murders and the long legal journey that had finally led to this moment. True crime enthusiasts and death penalty opponents organized vigils and protests, while victims' rights advocates prepared to witness what they hoped would be the final chapter in a case that had consumed 3 decades of their lives. The stage was set for an execution that would close the book on one of Florida's most disturbing family murder cases. But even as that final chapter approached, questions remained about justice, mercy, and whether the long delay between crime and punishment had served the interests of anyone involved. Thursday, October 19, 2023, dawned gray and overcast at Florida State Prison in Stark, as if the weather itself reflected the somber nature of the day's scheduled events. After nearly 30 years on death row, Edward John Zakrzewski II was finally facing the ultimate consequence for the murders of his wife Sylvia, and his children Kim and Anna. The execution protocol at Florida State Prison follows a precise choreography that has been refined over decades of carrying out death sentences. Every detail is planned and rehearsed, from the timing of the condemned inmate's final meal to the exact procedures followed in the execution chamber. For Edward, these final hours represented the end of a journey that had begun with a moment of unspeakable violence in 1994 and continued through 3 decades of legal proceedings. Edward spent his final day much as he had spent the previous 10,000 days, in a small cell, under constant observation, with limited contact with the outside world. But the atmosphere around him was different. The usual routines of death row life were suspended as prison officials prepared for the evening's execution. Guards who had known Edward for years went about their duties with the professional detachment necessary for such occasions, but the weight of the moment was palpable. As afternoon turned to evening, Edward was moved to the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. This stark room, just steps away from where he would die, served as his final earthly residence. Here, he could receive visits from his spiritual advisor and any family members who chose to see him one last time. The irony was not lost on observers that Edward would receive more opportunity for final goodbyes than he had given to his own wife and children 29 years earlier. Edward had chosen not to request a final meal, instead accepting the standard prison fare that was offered to all inmates. This decision, like many aspects of his final day, seemed to reflect a man who had finally accepted the inevitability of his fate. After decades of fighting for his life through the appeals process, he appeared to have reached a state of resignation, if not peace. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison is a sterile, clinical environment designed to carry out the state's ultimate punishment with efficiency and minimal drama. The gurney where Edward would spend his final moments was positioned to allow witnesses to observe the proceedings through reinforced glass windows. Separate viewing areas were designated for the victims' family members, official witnesses, media representatives, and Edward's own supporters, if any chose to attend. As the evening progressed, Edward was escorted the short distance from his holding cell to the execution chamber. The 58-year-old man who entered that room bore little resemblance to the 30-year-old Air Force sergeant who had committed the murders that brought him to this moment. His hair had gone gray, his face was lined with the passage of decades, and his body showed the effects of a sedentary life spent in confinement. The medical team responsible for administering the lethal injection worked with practiced efficiency to prepare Edward for execution. 4 lines were inserted into his arms, connecting him to the apparatus that would deliver the drugs designed to end his life. Throughout this process, Edward remained calm and cooperative, following the instructions of prison officials without resistance. At 6:30 p.m., the execution officially began. Edward was asked if he had any final words, a tradition that provides condemned inmates with one last opportunity to address the world. His statement was brief and, to many observers, inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. He expressed remorse for his actions and asked for forgiveness from the families of his victims, but his words seemed to carry little conviction or genuine emotion. The lethal injection process began with the administration of midazolam, a sedative designed to render the condemned inmate unconscious. This was followed by vecuronium bromide, which paralyzes the muscles and stops breathing, and finally potassium chloride, which stops the heart. The entire process, from the beginning of the injection to the pronouncement of death, took approximately 15 minutes. At 6:45 p.m. on October 19, 2023, Edward John Zakrzewski II was pronounced dead. The man who had taken 3 innocent lives in a brutal act of family annihilation had finally paid the ultimate price for his crimes. The execution marked the end of one of the longest-running death penalty cases in Florida history and brought a form of closure to a case that had haunted a community for nearly 3 decades. In the witness viewing area, some family members and friends of Sylvia, Kim, and Anna watched in silence as the man who had destroyed their lives took his final breaths. For them, Edward's execution represented not just justice, but perhaps the opportunity to finally move forward without the specter of his continued existence hanging over their attempts to heal and rebuild. The media representatives present prepared to inform the world that one of Florida's most notorious family killers had finally been executed. But even as they crafted their reports, questions lingered about whether justice had truly been served. Had the 3 decades between crime and punishment served any meaningful purpose? Did executing an elderly man for crimes committed in his youth represent justice or simply the completion of a bureaucratic process? The execution of Edward Zakrzewski marked the official end of a case that had spanned 3 decades, but the impact of his crimes extends far beyond the clinical confines of the execution chamber. The murders of Sylvia, Kim, and Anna Zakrzewski left ripples that continue to spread through the lives of everyone they touched, creating a legacy of loss that no amount of legal proceedings could ever fully address. In the quiet community of Mary Esther, Florida, the house where the murders occurred has changed hands multiple times over the years. New families have moved in, children have played in the same rooms where Kim and Anna once laughed and learned, and life has gradually reclaimed a space that was once defined by death. But for longtime residents, the address will always be remembered as the site of unthinkable violence, a reminder that evil can emerge in even the most peaceful settings. The military community at Eglin Air Force Base has also been forever changed by Edward's crimes. The case became a sobering lesson about the importance of recognizing warning signs and supporting military families under stress. New protocols and support systems were developed to help identify and assist service members experiencing family difficulties before they reach a crisis point. For the investigators, prosecutors, and legal professionals who worked on the case over the decades, Edward's crimes and subsequent execution represent both a victory for the justice system and a reminder of its limitations. While the legal process ultimately held Edward accountable for his actions, it could not undo the harm he had caused or restore the lives he had taken. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about the death penalty and its effectiveness as both a deterrent and a form of justice. Supporters of capital punishment point to Edward's case as an example of crime so heinous that they demand the ultimate punishment. Critics argue that the 3-decade delay between sentencing and execution undermines any deterrent effect and raises questions about the practical value of the death penalty. Perhaps most importantly, the Zakrzewski case serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact of domestic violence and the importance of taking threats within families seriously. Sylvia's request for a divorce was met not with respect for her autonomy and happiness, but with lethal violence from the man who had promised to love and protect her. The case highlights the particular vulnerability of children in domestic violence situations. Kim and Anna Zakrzewski were completely innocent victims who died simply because they existed in the wrong family at the wrong time. Their deaths underscore the need for robust systems to protect children from violent parents and to intervene before family conflicts escalate to lethal levels. As we reflect on this tragic case, we must remember that behind the legal proceedings, the media coverage, and the true crime narratives were real people whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Sylvia Zakrzewski was a wife and mother who deserved the chance to rebuild her life in a way that would bring her happiness. Kim and Anna were children who deserved to grow up, to experience first loves and graduations, to have families of their own, to contribute to the world in ways we will never know. The execution of Edward Zakrzewski brought legal closure to their case, but their memory lives on in the people who loved them and in the lessons their deaths can teach us about the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences of choosing violence over compassion. In the end, the Zakrzewski family murders remind us that true crime is not entertainment, it is the documentation of real human suffering and the ongoing struggle to understand how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. As we tell these stories, we must never forget the real cost of violence and the irreplaceable value of every life that is lost to senseless crime. The case file for Edward John Zakrzewski II is now closed, marked with the stamp of completion that comes only with execution. But the story of the Zakrzewski family, both their lives and their deaths, continues to resonate as a reminder of both the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and the importance of choosing love over violence, even in our darkest moments. Rest in peace, Sylvia, Kim, and Anna Zakrzewski. Your lives mattered, your deaths were not in vain if they help prevent future tragedies, and your memory deserves to outlast the infamy of the man who took you from this world far too soon. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling back to the mid-1980s, to a time when the city of Los Angeles lived under a shadow of terror. Our story begins not with the crimes themselves, but with understanding how a young boy born in El Paso, Texas, would become one of America's most notorious serial killers. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children born to Mexican immigrants Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. Born Ricardo Leyva Muñoz Ramirez, he was known affectionately in the family as Richard or Ricky, alongside his 4 siblings, Robert, Ruth, Joseph, and Reuben. From the very beginning, Richard's life was marked by adversity. His mother worked at a boot factory, where she was exposed to chemical fumes during her pregnancy. All of Richard's siblings were born with birth defects, ranging from respiratory difficulties to bone deformities. At age 2, a dresser fell on Richard's head, causing a large forehead laceration, an injury that would be the first of several head traumas that may have altered the course of his young life. Richard grew up in a violent household where his father was physically abusive, regularly beating both Richard and his mother. These frequent episodes of abuse contributed to brain damage, and by age 10, Richard had begun experimenting with drugs as an escape from his harsh reality. Despite the chaos at home, Richard showed promise as a student and athlete. He showed particular talent as a football player and could have pursued a normal life, but fate had other plans. The turning point came when Richard was 12 years old, through his relationship with an older cousin who had served as a soldier in Vietnam. This cousin, a Vietnam War veteran, showed the impressionable 12-year-old Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have raped, tortured, and killed during his service. The images were graphic and disturbing, but rather than being horrified, young Richard became fascinated. This exposure to violence and sexual brutality during his early teens began developing his interests in the macabre. The influence of this cousin cannot be understated. As a teenager, Richard fell into the company of this older, sadistic cousin who boasted of raping and killing numerous women, which fascinated Ramirez. But the cousin's influence went beyond just stories and photographs. Richard watched his cousin murder his own fiancée, an act of violence that seemed to complete Richard's transformation from troubled youth to something far more dangerous. By his late teens, Richard had dropped out of high school and was drifting. The combination of childhood abuse, head injuries, drug use, and exposure to extreme violence had created a perfect storm. He began committing petty crimes, then more serious offenses, as he made his way from Texas to California, where the bright lights and sprawling suburbs would provide the perfect hunting ground for what he would become. Richard Ramirez's reign of terror officially began on June 28, 1984, with the murder of a 79-year-old woman. But to understand the full scope of what would unfold, we need to recognize that Richard didn't immediately become the methodical killer he would later be known as. His early crimes were opportunistic, driven by a need for money to fuel his drug addiction, but they quickly escalated into something far more sinister. From April 1984 to August 1985, Ramirez would murder at least 15 people during various break-ins, with his crimes usually taking place after dark. This nocturnal pattern would earn him several chilling nicknames from the press and law enforcement: the Night Stalker, the Walk-in Killer, and the Valley Intruder. What made Richard's crimes particularly terrifying was their random nature. Unlike many serial killers who target a specific type of victim, Richard's attacks seemed to follow no discernible pattern. He would break into homes across Los Angeles and surrounding areas, targeting victims of all ages, from young children to elderly couples. His methods varied as well. Sometimes he would use a gun, other times a knife, hammer, or whatever weapon was convenient. The summer of 1984 saw a steady increase in these brutal home invasions. Richard would typically cut phone lines and disable electrical systems before entering homes, often through unlocked doors or windows. He would move through houses like a ghost, comfortable in the darkness that had become his domain. Survivors would later describe him as unusually quiet, able to move through a home without making a sound until he was ready to strike. What truly chilled investigators and the public was Richard's apparent enjoyment of the terror he caused. He would often wake victims before attacking them, forcing them to look into his eyes. Survivors reported that he seemed to feed off their fear, sometimes spending long periods in homes, eating food from refrigerators or watching television, as if the house temporarily belonged to him. His actions incited widespread fear in the Los Angeles area, and as 1984 turned to 1985, that fear would only intensify. Richard was becoming bolder, more confident, and significantly more violent. The spring of 1985 marked a dramatic escalation in both the frequency and brutality of Richard's attacks. By March 1985, Ramirez had escalated his violence significantly. Within a 10-day period, there had been 5 more attacks, with just one victim left alive. Maria Hernandez of Rosemead was able to escape one of these attacks, becoming one of the few people to encounter Richard and live to tell about it. Her survival would prove crucial to the investigation, as she was able to provide one of the first detailed descriptions of the attacker who was terrorizing Southern California. The third and fourth murders during this period took place at the Whittier home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzera. The attack on the Zazzera couple demonstrated the depths of Richard's depravity. The elderly couple was brutally murdered in their own bedroom, and the crime scene was so horrific that even seasoned homicide detectives were shaken by what they found. What made Richard's crimes particularly challenging for law enforcement was their geographic spread. He didn't confine himself to one neighborhood or even one city. His attacks spanned across Los Angeles County and into surrounding areas, making it difficult for different police departments to initially connect the crimes. Richard was clever about this, seeming to understand that jurisdictional boundaries could work in his favor. During this period, Richard's signature behaviors began to emerge more clearly. He had developed an fascination with Satanism and the occult, often leaving behind satanic symbols at crime scenes. He would draw pentagrams on his hand and yell out, "Hail Satan," during his attacks. This theatrical element added another layer of horror to his crimes and would later become a key part of his court appearances. The randomness of his target selection continued to confound investigators. In a single week, he might attack a young couple in their 20s, an elderly widow, and a family with children. There seemed to be no demographic profile that could help predict where he might strike next. This unpredictability was perhaps his greatest weapon, as it meant that no one in the greater Los Angeles area could feel truly safe. As spring turned to summer in 1985, the attacks became more frequent and more savage. Richard was no longer just a burglar who sometimes killed, he had evolved into something far more dangerous. The media began to take notice, and the story of the mysterious nighttime attacker began to dominate local news coverage. By the summer of 1985, law enforcement agencies across Southern California were under enormous pressure to catch the killer who had come to be known as the Night Stalker. The case drew the attention of experienced homicide detectives Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, with Salerno being particularly notable for his previous work in solving the Hillside Strangler murders in 1977 and 1978. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Richard's crimes crossed multiple jurisdictions. Police departments in Los Angeles, Glendale, Burbank, Arcadia, Monterey Park, and other cities were all dealing with attacks that seemed to be connected, but coordinating between agencies was challenging. Eventually, a multi-agency task force was formed, bringing together detectives from across the region. One of the breakthrough moments in the investigation came through forensic evidence. Richard had been sloppy in some of his earlier crimes, leaving behind fingerprints and footprints that could be analyzed. The development of more sophisticated forensic techniques in the 1980s meant that investigators had tools available that hadn't existed in previous decades. The media coverage of the Night Stalker case was intense and, in some ways, counterproductive to the investigation. While the publicity helped generate tips from the public, it also seemed to encourage Richard's grandiose behavior. He appeared to enjoy the attention and the fear he was generating across the city. Multiple victims who survived encounters with Ramirez were interviewed and were able to provide investigators with increasingly detailed descriptions of their attacker. These survivor accounts painted a picture of a man who was not just violent, but who seemed to take psychological pleasure in the terror he caused. The descriptions were consistent: a tall, thin man with long dark hair, bad teeth, and distinctive eyes that many survivors described as evil or dead. He often wore all black clothing and moved with a confidence that suggested he was comfortable with violence. Some survivors reported that he had a particular smell, a combination of body odor and leather. As the summer progressed, the task force began to close in on their suspect. They had developed a profile, they had physical evidence, and they had multiple witness descriptions. What they needed was a break that would lead them to Richard's identity. The beginning of the end for Richard Ramirez came not through traditional detective work, but through a stroke of luck combined with advances in forensic science. The key breakthrough came when investigators were able to match fingerprints found at multiple crime scenes to prints in the criminal database. Richard's fingerprints were on file due to previous minor arrests, and when the computer system finally made the match, investigators suddenly had a name to go with their suspect. For the first time since the killing spree had begun, they knew exactly who they were looking for: Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, also known as Richard Ramirez. The revelation of Richard's identity allowed investigators to piece together his background and movements. They discovered his connections to El Paso, his history of drug abuse, and his pattern of drifting between California and Texas. This information helped them understand not just who he was, but potentially where he might be. In August 1985, Richard made what would prove to be a fatal mistake. He took a bus journey from Arizona back to California. By this time, his photograph had been released to the media, and his face was becoming recognizable to people across the Southwest. When Richard's bus arrived in Los Angeles, he was spotted by a group of elderly women who identified him as the killer. Realizing he had been recognized, Richard attempted to flee and tried to carjack another woman. This desperate attempt to escape would prove to be his undoing. Bystanders intervened during the carjacking attempt and chased him away. Richard, now panicked and on foot, tried to escape through a residential neighborhood. But the community had been living in fear for over a year, and when word spread that the Night Stalker was in their midst, ordinary citizens mobilized to help capture him. The chase through the streets of East Los Angeles became a community effort. Richard, exhausted and outnumbered, was eventually cornered by a group of residents who held him until police could arrive. After more than a year of terrorizing Southern California, Richard Ramirez was finally in custody. The arrest brought a sense of relief to the entire region, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story, one that would involve a lengthy legal process and would ultimately reveal more about the man behind the monster. When Richard Ramirez finally went to trial in 1988, he was facing serious charges: 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The scope of the charges reflected the breadth of his crime spree and the multiple jurisdictions where he had committed offenses. The trial was as dramatic as the crimes themselves. Richard seemed to relish the attention, often appearing in court with sunglasses and making theatrical gestures. He would draw pentagrams on his hand and yell out, "Hail Satan," during court proceedings, maintaining the satanic imagery that had marked many of his crimes. The jury ultimately convicted him of 11 murders in Southern California and 2 others in the San Francisco area. The evidence against him was overwhelming: fingerprints, witness testimony, survivor identifications, and physical evidence all pointed to his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. During the trial, more details emerged about Richard's troubled background. His father even attempted to provide an alibi, claiming his son was in El Paso, Texas, in May 1985, when he had allegedly committed several crimes. However, records from a Los Angeles dentist office showed Ramirez had appeared for an appointment on May 30, undermining this alibi attempt. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had chosen evil, while the defense tried to argue that his troubled childhood and possible brain damage had contributed to his actions. Expert witnesses testified about the effects of childhood abuse, head injuries, and drug use on brain development and behavior. Richard was convicted and sentenced to death in 1989. The death sentence was seen by many as appropriate given the heinous nature of his crimes and the terror he had inflicted on Southern California communities. However, the death sentence would never be carried out. The Night Stalker, sentenced to death in 1989 for 13 murders, escaped execution when he died of natural causes in 2013. He died in prison on June 7, 2013, while still awaiting execution. The case of Richard Ramirez had a profound impact on law enforcement, communities, and individuals far beyond Southern California. His crimes came at a time when many people still felt relatively safe in their homes, particularly in suburban areas. The random nature of his attacks shattered that sense of security for many. From a law enforcement perspective, the Night Stalker case highlighted both the challenges and opportunities presented by advances in forensic science. The ability to match fingerprints across multiple crime scenes and jurisdictions was crucial to solving the case, and it demonstrated the importance of computer databases and interagency cooperation. The case also showed how media coverage could both help and hinder an investigation. While the publicity generated valuable tips from the public and ultimately contributed to Richard's capture, it also seemed to fuel his ego and may have encouraged some of his more theatrical behaviors. For the survivors of Richard's attacks, the impact was lifelong. Many required extensive physical and psychological treatment, and some never fully recovered from their encounters with him. Their courage in testifying during the trial and their willingness to share their stories helped ensure that justice was served. The communities where Richard struck were also permanently changed. Home security became a much higher priority for many residents, and the random nature of the attacks meant that people across economic and demographic lines felt vulnerable in ways they hadn't before. Richard's case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the death penalty, the treatment of mental illness in the criminal justice system, and the role that childhood trauma plays in creating violent criminals. While these debates continue, his case remains one of the most studied examples of serial killing in American criminal history. To understand Richard Ramirez fully, we must look beyond the crimes to the complex factors that created the Night Stalker. His story is not just one of evil choices, but of a convergence of biological, psychological, and social factors that created a perfect storm of violence. The head injuries Richard sustained as a child, combined with his exposure to toxic chemicals in utero, may have contributed to neurological damage that affected his ability to control impulses and feel empathy. The physical and emotional abuse he suffered at home created an environment where violence was normalized and survival often meant hurting others before they could hurt you. The influence of his cousin cannot be overlooked. At a crucial developmental stage, Richard was exposed to graphic images of sexual violence and was taught to view such brutality as acceptable, even admirable. This twisted mentorship occurred at exactly the age when his own identity and moral framework were being formed. Drug use, beginning at age 10, further damaged Richard's developing brain and provided an escape from reality that may have made it easier for him to commit increasingly serious crimes. The combination of drugs and pre-existing neurological issues created a dangerous cocktail that impaired his judgment and lowered his inhibitions. But perhaps most importantly, Richard made choices. Despite his troubled background, he had moments where he could have chosen different paths. He had opportunities for education, athletics, and legitimate work that he rejected in favor of crime. While his background may explain his actions, it does not excuse them. The question of nature versus nurture in creating violent criminals remains hotly debated, and Richard's case provides evidence for both sides. What is clear is that his story represents a tragic waste of human potential and the devastating consequences when society fails to protect and properly develop its most vulnerable children. The end of Richard Ramirez's life in 2013 closed a chapter that had begun decades earlier in a troubled home in El Paso, Texas. But the impact of his crimes continues to reverberate through the lives of survivors, the families of victims, and the communities he terrorized. For law enforcement, the Night Stalker case became a template for how to handle serial crime investigations. The importance of multi-agency cooperation, the value of computer databases for tracking evidence across jurisdictions, and the role of media relations in major cases were all lessons learned from the Ramirez investigation. The forensic techniques developed and refined during the investigation of Richard's crimes have since been applied to countless other cases. The fingerprint matching that ultimately led to his identification was relatively new technology at the time, but it has since become standard practice in criminal investigations worldwide. For the mental health community, Richard's case has provided valuable insights into the development of antisocial behavior and the long-term effects of childhood trauma. His story is frequently studied in criminology and psychology programs as an example of how multiple risk factors can combine to create violent behavior. The victims and survivors of Richard's crimes have shown remarkable resilience in the decades since his capture. Many have become advocates for victims' rights, home security awareness, and criminal justice reform. Their strength in the face of unimaginable trauma serves as a testament to the human capacity for healing and growth. Perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a reminder of the preciousness of ordinary life and the importance of community. The terror that Richard brought to Southern California was ultimately ended by ordinary citizens who refused to be paralyzed by fear and who took action to protect their neighbors. As we reach the end of this journey through one of America's most disturbing criminal cases, it's worth reflecting on what the story of Richard Ramirez teaches us about human nature, society, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. Richard's story is ultimately a cautionary tale about the importance of early intervention, the devastating effects of childhood abuse, and the way that untreated trauma can metastasize into something far more dangerous. It reminds us that behind every monster was once a child, and that society has a responsibility to protect and nurture its most vulnerable members. But it's also a story about resilience, the resilience of survivors who rebuilt their lives, of communities that came together in the face of terror, and of law enforcement officers who never gave up on bringing a killer to justice. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, human beings are capable of courage, compassion, and justice. The Night Stalker's reign of terror lasted just over a year, but it took decades for some of its effects to fully heal. In the end, Richard Ramirez became exactly what he chose to become, a symbol of evil that is remembered not for any positive contribution to the world, but for the suffering he caused and the lives he destroyed. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that Richard's story, while dark, is also a story about the triumph of good over evil, of justice over chaos, and of communities coming together to protect the innocent. In a world that can sometimes seem overwhelmingly dangerous, the capture of the Night Stalker reminds us that monsters can be stopped, that justice can prevail, and that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. The case of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, remains one of the most studied and discussed serial killer cases in American history. His crimes terrorized Southern California, but his capture demonstrated the power of modern forensic science, interagency cooperation, and community action. While his story is one of darkness and evil, it is also, ultimately, a story of justice served in communities that refuse to be destroyed by fear. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburbs of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where Amish farmland stretches endlessly under wide skies, the winter of 1991 brought a darkness that would forever change a community. This is the story of Lori Sho, a 16-year-old girl whose life was cut tragically short by the twisted obsession of those who should have been her peers, her friends, her classmates, walking the same hallways and sharing the same dreams of graduation and the future beyond. December 20, 1991, dawned cold and gray in East Lampeter Township. Snow had fallen the night before, creating that hushed blanket of white that makes everything seem peaceful, serene. But inside apartment 101 of the Whitehall Apartments on Beechdale Road, peace was about to be shattered forever. Lori Sho was not supposed to be home that morning. The petite blonde sophomore from Conestoga Valley High School had planned to be in school, sitting in her morning classes, perhaps thinking about the approaching Christmas break just days away. Instead, she had stayed home sick, a decision that would prove fateful in ways no one could have imagined. Her mother, Hazel Sho, a hardworking single parent who juggled multiple jobs to support her daughter, had left early that morning for work at a local business. Hazel was devoted to Lori, protective of her only child, and had been increasingly worried about her daughter in recent months. There had been threats, harassment, a growing sense of danger that seemed to follow Lori wherever she went. The troubles had begun innocuously enough, the way teenage drama often does. During the summer of 1991, Lori had briefly dated a young man named Lawrence Yunkin. 20 years old, with dark hair and an easy charm that masked something more troubling beneath, Yunkin was older than the typical high school crowd. The relationship between Lori and Lawrence was short-lived, lasting only a few weeks, but its consequences would prove devastating. Lawrence Yunkin was already involved with another girl, Lisa Michelle Lambert, an 18-year-old who attended the same high school as Lori. Lisa was known for her striking appearance, her confident demeanor, and her intense, possessive nature when it came to relationships. When she discovered that Lawrence had been seeing Lori, something dark awakened within her, a jealousy so consuming, so all-encompassing, that it would grow into an obsession that knew no bounds. What Lori later confided to her mother about that brief relationship with Lawrence was deeply troubling. She told Hazel that Lawrence had raped her during one of their encounters, a revelation that added another layer of trauma to an already complicated situation. But Lisa Lambert either didn't know about this assault or didn't care. In her mind, Lori Sho had committed an unforgivable sin by being with her boyfriend, and for this transgression, she would make Lori pay. The harassment began almost immediately. Lisa would call Lori at home, her voice cold and threatening as she promised retribution. She would follow Lori around school, glaring at her from across hallways, making her presence known and felt. The threats escalated steadily. Lisa told friends and anyone who would listen that she was going to hurt Lori, that she was going to make her suffer for what she had done. But Lisa Lambert was not acting alone in her campaign of terror. She had enlisted the help of 17-year-old Tabitha Buck, a girl who seemed willing to follow Lisa's lead in this twisted game of vengeance. Tabitha was younger, perhaps more impressionable, but equally willing to participate in the escalating harassment of Lori Sho. And then there was Lawrence Yunkin himself, the catalyst for all this hatred, the man whose brief relationship with Lori had set these terrible events in motion. Rather than taking responsibility for his actions or calling off his girlfriend's increasingly dangerous behavior, Lawrence seemed content to let the situation spiral out of control. He would prove to be not just a passive observer, but an active participant in what was to come. For months, this harassment continued. Lori lived in a state of constant fear, looking over her shoulder, dreading each day at school. She confided in her mother about some of what was happening, but like many teenagers, she kept much of her terror to herself, perhaps hoping it would simply go away, that these girls would grow bored and move on to someone else. The threats grew more specific, more violent. Lisa Lambert told people that she wasn't just going to scare Lori, she was going to hurt her. Witnesses later testified that they had heard Lisa say she planned to scare Lori, then hurt her, then slit her throat. These weren't the idle threats of teenage drama, these were the carefully planned promises of someone whose jealousy had curdled into something much more dangerous. On the evening of December 19, 1991, the night before the murder, Lawrence Yun Kin drove Lisa Lambert to a local Kmart. Under the fluorescent lights of the store, Lisa walked the aisles with purpose, selecting items that would seem innocent to a casual observer but had a much more sinister purpose. She purchased rope, hats, and gloves, materials that would be used in the crime that was already forming in her mind. That night, as Lori Sho slept in her bedroom, unaware of the danger closing in around her, Lisa Lambert, Tabitha Buck, and Lawrence Yun Kin were finalizing their plans. They knew that Hazel Sho worked early morning shifts. They knew that Lori would likely be home alone. They knew exactly when and how they would strike. The morning of December 20th arrived with that deceptive winter calm. Hazel Sho kissed her daughter goodbye and left for work, as she had done countless times before. Lori, feeling unwell, stayed in bed, perhaps hoping that a day of rest would help her feel better. She had no way of knowing that 3 people were already on their way to her apartment, their intentions murderous. The plan was methodical in its cruelty. Lawrence Yun Kin would serve as the getaway driver, positioning himself nearby but not directly participating in the violence to come. Lisa Lambert and Tabitha Buck would be the ones to enter the apartment, to confront Lori, to carry out the attack that Lisa had been planning for months. Sometime that morning, there was a knock at the door of apartment 101. Lori, perhaps thinking it was a friend or someone making a delivery, answered. What happened next would be reconstructed later through physical evidence, witness testimony, and the dying words of Lori herself. Lisa Lambert and Tabitha Buck forced their way into the apartment. They had come prepared for violence, carrying weapons and the supplies that Lisa had purchased the night before. What followed was not a quick, impulsive act of violence, but a prolonged, brutal attack that spoke to the depth of Lisa's hatred and the complete lack of humanity that had taken hold of both girls. The attack was savage in its intensity. Lori was beaten, strangled, and stabbed multiple times. The knife wounds were extensive and deliberate, a 5-inch gash across her throat, a stab wound that punctured her lung, another deep cut that penetrated her thigh all the way to the pelvic bone, and yet another that grazed her spine. These were not the random strikes of someone in a frenzy, they were the calculated wounds of someone who wanted to cause maximum pain and suffering. But Lori Sho, despite being only 16 years old and small in stature, fought for her life with everything she had. The apartment showed signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, blood spattered across surfaces, evidence of a young woman who refused to die quietly. She managed to survive long enough to crawl to the phone, her lifeblood flowing out of her, and attempt to call for help. When Hazel Sho returned home from work around 12:30 that afternoon, she discovered a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her daughter lay in a pool of blood, barely clinging to life, her body bearing the evidence of an attack so vicious that it spoke to a hatred beyond normal human comprehension. But Lori was still alive, still conscious, still able to speak. In what would be her final moments, as her mother held her and screamed for help, Lori managed to utter words that would prove crucial to solving her murder. With her last breath, looking into her mother's eyes, she whispered, "Michelle did it. I love you." Those 4 words would lead police directly to Lisa Michelle Lambert and her accomplices. But even as Lori spoke them, even as she identified her killer with her dying breath, her life was slipping away. She died before paramedics could save her, there in her mother's arms, a 16-year-old girl whose only crime had been briefly dating the wrong person. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Police had their prime suspect's name from the victim herself, and they quickly learned about the months of harassment and threats that had preceded the murder. The evidence against Lisa Lambert was overwhelming: witness testimony about her threats, the supplies she had purchased the night before, and most damning of all, Lori's dying declaration. On December 22, 1991, just 2 days after the murder, police arrested 3 suspects: Lisa Michelle Lambert, 18 years old and the apparent ringleader; Tabitha Buck, 17 and a willing accomplice; and Lawrence Yun Kin, 20 years old and the man whose relationship with Lori had started this entire tragic chain of events. The arrest sent shockwaves through Lancaster County. This was not the random act of a stranger or the result of a drug deal gone wrong. This was teenage jealousy taken to its most extreme and horrific conclusion. 3 young people, barely adults themselves, had planned and carried out the murder of a classmate over what amounted to a brief summer romance. The legal proceedings that followed would span years and generate tremendous media attention. The case became a sensation, not just locally but nationally, as people struggled to understand how teenage jealousy could lead to such brutal violence. Lawrence Yun Kin, perhaps recognizing the gravity of his situation and seeking to minimize his own culpability, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. He pled guilty to third-degree murder and agreed to testify against Lisa Lambert and Tabitha Buck in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony would prove crucial in establishing the premeditated nature of the crime and the roles each defendant played in Lori's murder. Yun Kin described how Lisa had planned the attack for weeks, how she had purchased the supplies they would need, how she had enlisted Tabitha's help in carrying out her revenge. He portrayed himself as a reluctant participant, someone who had been swept along by Lisa's obsession rather than an active planner of the crime. The trials of Lisa Lambert and Tabitha Buck revealed the full extent of the harassment campaign that had preceded the murder. Witnesses testified about Lisa's threats, about her obsessive jealousy, about her explicit statements that she intended to hurt Lori. Teachers and students from Conestoga Valley High School described an atmosphere of fear that had surrounded Lori in her final months, a constant sense of danger that she had lived with as Lisa's obsession grew stronger. The physical evidence was equally damning. The supplies purchased at Kmart were found at the crime scene. DNA evidence linked both girls to the apartment. The brutality of the attack spoke to a level of premeditation and malice that went far beyond a crime of passion. But perhaps most powerful of all was Lori's own testimony from beyond the grave, those final words identifying Michelle, Lisa's middle name, which she commonly used, as her killer. In Pennsylvania courts, dying declarations are considered among the most reliable forms of evidence, given on the assumption that someone facing death has no reason to lie. The trials were emotional affairs, with Hazel Show testifying about finding her daughter dying in their home, about Lori's final words, about the months of fear that had preceded the murder. The community rallied around Hazel, offering support and demanding justice for Lori. Lisa Lambert's defense attempted to portray her as a troubled young woman who had been manipulated by others, but the evidence of her leadership role in planning and carrying out the murder was too strong to overcome. Witnesses testified about her explicit threats, her purchasing of supplies, her obsessive jealousy that had driven her to violence. In the end, justice was swift and decisive. Lisa Michelle Lambert was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury found that she had been the ringleader, the primary architect of Lori's death, and they showed no mercy in their verdict. Tabitha Buck, being younger and arguably less culpable than Lambert, was convicted of second-degree murder. She initially received a life sentence as well, but this would later be modified due to Supreme Court decisions regarding juvenile sentencing. She was eventually granted parole in 2019, after serving nearly 28 years in prison. Lawrence Yun Kin, in exchange for his cooperation and testimony, received a sentence of 10 to 20 years for third-degree murder. He was released from prison in 2003, having served approximately 12 years for his role in Lori's death. But even after the trials ended and the sentences were handed down, the case continued to generate controversy and legal challenges. Lisa Lambert maintained her innocence and filed appeal after appeal, claiming that she had been wrongfully convicted, that the evidence against her had been fabricated or misinterpreted. Her appeals process would drag on for years, with Lambert's supporters arguing that she had been the victim of prosecutorial misconduct and that the real killer had escaped justice. They pointed to what they claimed were inconsistencies in the physical evidence and suggested that Lawrence Yun Kin had been more involved in the actual murder than he had admitted. These appeals gained some traction over the years, with various legal experts and advocates taking up Lambert's cause. The case was featured in books, documentaries, and television shows, with some presentations suggesting that there had been a miscarriage of justice and that the wrong person had been convicted. However, the overwhelming weight of evidence continued to support the original convictions. Laurie's dying declaration, the witness testimony about Lisa's threats and obsessive behavior, the physical evidence linking her to the crime scene, and the testimony of her co-conspirators all pointed to her guilt. The case also highlighted broader issues about teenage violence, bullying, and the dangerous escalation of interpersonal conflicts in high school settings. Experts pointed to the Laurie Show murder as an extreme example of how unchecked jealousy and obsession can lead to tragic consequences. In the years following the murder, Conestoga Valley High School and other schools in the area implemented new programs designed to identify and address threatening behavior before it could escalate to violence. The case became a cautionary tale used in discussions about teenage relationships, conflict resolution, and the warning signs of dangerous obsession. Hazel Show, meanwhile, became an advocate for victims' rights and for greater awareness of stalking and harassment. She worked tirelessly to ensure that her daughter's story would not be forgotten, that Laurie's death would serve as a warning to others about the dangers of unchecked jealousy and violence. The apartment where Laurie died was eventually demolished, but the memory of what happened there lingered in the community. For many residents of Lancaster County, the case served as a stark reminder that evil could exist anywhere, even in their quiet, peaceful corner of Pennsylvania. As the years passed, the principals in the case aged and changed. Tabitha Buck, released on parole in 2019, attempted to rebuild her life after spending nearly 3 decades in prison for a crime committed when she was just 17 years old. Lawrence Yun Kin, released much earlier, disappeared from public view, apparently seeking to put his involvement in the case behind him. But Lisa Michelle Lambert remained in prison, still maintaining her innocence, still filing appeals and seeking to overturn her conviction. Her supporters continued to argue that she had been wrongfully convicted, while Laurie's family and friends remained convinced that justice had been served. The case continued to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and legal scholars alike. It represented the intersection of several compelling elements: teenage jealousy, obsessive behavior, brutal violence, and questions about the reliability of eyewitness testimony and physical evidence. What made the case particularly haunting was its ordinariness in some respects. These were not hardened criminals or members of organized crime syndicates. They were teenagers from middle-class families, students at a typical American high school, young people who should have been thinking about graduation and college and their futures. Instead, they became involved in a crime so brutal and senseless that it shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. The fact that such violence could emerge from what appeared to be a typical teenage love triangle spoke to darker truths about human nature and the potential for evil that exists within ordinary people. The murder of Laurie Show also highlighted the particular dangers faced by young women in abusive or threatening situations. Laurie had tried to report the harassment she was experiencing, but like many victims of stalking and threats, she found it difficult to get others to take her concerns seriously until it was too late. Her story became part of a broader conversation about domestic violence, stalking, and the need for better protection for victims of threats and harassment. Laws were strengthened in Pennsylvania and other states to give law enforcement more tools to intervene in cases of stalking and threatening behavior before they escalated to violence. The case also raised questions about the role of bystanders in preventing violence. Several people had heard Lisa Lambert's threats against Laurie Show, but none had taken action to warn Laurie or alert authorities. The murder served as a reminder that threats of violence should always be taken seriously, regardless of the age or apparent circumstances of those making them. For the families involved, the case represented a tragedy from which none would ever fully recover. Hazel Show lost her only child in the most horrific way imaginable, and spent the rest of her life dealing with the trauma of that loss. The families of the perpetrators also suffered, grappling with the reality that their children had been involved in such a terrible crime. The community of Lancaster County was forever changed by the murder. It shattered the sense of safety and innocence that had characterized the area, replacing it with a more complex understanding of the potential for violence that could exist anywhere, even in the most seemingly peaceful communities. As we reflect on this case more than 30 years later, it continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the deadly potential of unchecked jealousy and obsession. Laurie Show was just 16 years old when her life was cut short, a young woman with dreams and aspirations who became the victim of someone else's twisted need for revenge. Her story reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person, someone who was loved, who had hopes for the future, who deserved to live a full and happy life. Laurie Show was not just a victim in a sensational murder case, she was a daughter, a friend, a student with her whole life ahead of her. The brutality of her death continues to shock, but perhaps more important is the memory of who she was in life, a young woman who fought for her survival until her final breath, who used her last moments of consciousness to identify her killer and seek justice from beyond the grave. In the end, the murder of Laurie Show stands as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsessive jealousy and a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Even in her final moments, facing unimaginable violence and terror, Laurie Show found the courage to speak the truth, to identify her attacker, and to ensure that justice would eventually be served. Her legacy lives on not just in the legal precedent set by her case or the safety measures implemented in its aftermath, but in the memory of a brave young woman who refused to let evil have the final word. Michelle did it. "I love you," she told her mother with her dying breath, words that would solve her own murder and provide comfort to those who loved her, even in the darkest hour of their lives. The case of Laurie Show remains one of the most compelling and tragic true crime stories of the 1990s, a reminder that violence can emerge from the most unexpected places and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. It stands as a testament to the power of truth, the importance of speaking out against threats and harassment, and the enduring love between a mother and daughter that not even death could break. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Laurie Show not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a young woman who lived bravely, loved deeply, and in her final moments, found the strength to ensure that the truth would be known. Her story, tragic as it is, reminds us of the preciousness of life and the importance of standing up against hatred and violence wherever we encounter them. Rest peacefully, knowing that justice was served, that truth prevailed, and that even in the darkest of human moments, love and courage can shine through. The memory of Laurie Show lives on, a bright light in the darkness, a reminder that every life has value and that every voice deserves to be heard. May your dreams tonight be filled with peace and hope for a world where such tragedies become increasingly rare, where young people can grow up safe from the kind of hatred and violence that took Laurie Show from this world far too soon. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.